Hi, my name's Ho-Jung Kim. I am a University of Chicago graduate who got a 36 on the ACT and a 2360 on the SAT. Today, I'm going to explain how you can get a 36 on the ACT in 2025. This video is meant to be a broader overview rather than a deep dive into every single problem type that you're going to need to study in order to get a 36. But I will deep dive into individual problem types in later videos, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to get notified about those videos when I upload them later. So this is my own ACT score report from back in 2013. A couple things you should be aware of about the ACT. It's divided into four sections: English, math, reading, and science, each of which will be scored out of 36 to combine into your overall ACT score. That's different from the SAT, which has two sections, the reading, writing, and math, which are both out of 800 and add up to your overall score. You'll notice that I got a 35 on two of the sections, but still got a 36 composite score. So it's important to keep in mind that your overall score can end up being better than any one individual section. Also, starting in April 2025 for the online version, which means already, and September 2025 for the written version, the ACT is changing. That means there's going to be less questions per section. The test itself will be shorter, but you'll get more time for each section. And that means ultimately you'll get more time per question. The math section is what's changing the most. Instead of having 5 possible answer choices for each question, that's now going down to 4. The idea was to make the structure of the ACT math section closer to that of the SAT, and hopefully that makes the ACT math section overall easier too. Here's a full side-by-side view of all the changes to number of questions and time per section. You'll notice that the science section is optional now too. You'll want to check with your individual colleges to see whether or not to actually include the science section in your official score submission. But since this is the first year that the section is optional, I believe that most colleges will still want to see it. Now, the part you've been waiting for, how to get a 36 on each section. While the order of the actual ACT will be English, math, reading, and then finally science, I'm going to introduce these sections in the order that I would actually recommend studying for them, which is English, reading and science, and then math. Focusing on these sections in this order, one at a time, is what I've found to yield the highest score increase for my students. That means if you have 3 months left until your official ACT, you might want to spend that first month studying just for the English section, the second month studying just for reading and science together, and then finally studying for the math section in the third month. On the ACT English section, while there are a few other question types like overall structure or best choice vocabulary, ultimately, the most important thing to study and understand is clause structure. That means all of the different rules around commas, periods, transition words, and everything else that goes into how the two different clause types, independent and dependent, work together in a sentence. Understanding what subject or object, a verb or identifier is referencing, being able to break down the sentence into its component clauses, that is the primary skill that the ACT English section tests. Let's walk through a sample English problem to show you how it relates to clause structure. This problem is a pretty standard one. It's asking you to make the best choice for the structure to make grammatical sense. Here's the sentence. When displaying such a small portion of artifacts severely limits public access and therefore public education. Okay, that sounds weird, but why? It's because using the word when, a conjunction, makes this sentence a dependent clause. But as we know from clause structure, a dependent clause cannot stand in a sentence on its own. It doesn't work as a valid sentence. There has to be at least one independent clause for it to be a valid sentence. So it can't be A, no change. B and C are slightly different, but both don't work for the same reason. It doesn't give you a valid clause structure for the sentence. That only leaves D. And by changing the first word of the sentence to just displaying, we now have a valid subject for the sentence. The act of displaying the artifacts, the subject, verb, severely limits public access and therefore public education. Now we have an independent clause that stands on its own and works as a valid sentence. Now, obviously, this is just one of the many types of questions on the English ACT section, but many of these questions do come back to how clauses, independent and dependent, must be structured by the rules of English grammar to make valid sentences. And if you can understand how that works, you'll be well on your way to scoring a 36 on this section. Okay, now we're going to talk about reading and science as if they were the same section, because ultimately the approach that you're going to take is going to be the same for both. So for both the reading and the science section, you're first going to start by reading and annotating the passage. That means taking notes to summarize each paragraph, each diagram for the science section that is going to be on there, and making sure that you understand piece by piece where to find the relevant information for each question you're going to encounter. Then you're going to read the questions, but I find that you don't want to read the answers. You want to just read the question and reference your notes to figure out which paragraph or diagram the relevant information to answer that question is going to be. Then you're going to use your annotations to paraphrase your own answer in your own words to the question. And finally, you're going to take the paraphrasing of the answer that you have in your mind, and then you're going to match it to the best answer choice that the ACT offers. Let's follow that step by step process for this passage. So, when I'm reading this passage, I would probably annotate it with something like this paragraph describes what the bowl looked like and why it was special, right? It's talking about the wonderful thing about this bowl, Andrea thought, was that it was both subtle and noticeable. Its glaze was this color, it was kind of like this way. So, I would just simply sum that up as what the bowl looked like and why it was special. Okay, great. Now, when I'm looking at this question, I'm not looking at the answers. I'm just reading. According to the passage, the random placement of colors in the bowl's glaze creates a surface that. Okay, that question indicates to me that I should go back to the part of the passage that talked about what the bowl looked like and why it was special, because it's talking about the random placement of colors in the bowl's glaze in this question. And when I reference this paragraph that I had this annotation for, there's a sentence here that says something about the colors and their random placement suggested motion. So I have a word for word match of a phrase from the question in the actual passage. Now I can paraphrase my own answer to this question. The random placement created a surface that suggested motion, as the passage says. And finally, when I look at the answers, the answer choice that best matches my own paraphrase, suggested motion, is G. It seemed to move. Now, the reason that I recommend studying for the reading and science section at the same time in your study for the ACT is that ultimately the approach that you take to the reading section is very similar to that of the science section. The only difference on the science section is that you have diagrams. So when you're annotating the reading section and putting a note for each paragraph, you can do very much the same thing with the science section, except you can kind of simplify and annotate how each diagram or graph is meant to be understood. And then you can do the same thing as in the reading section. You can look at the question and see which part of the science passage you should look at based on your annotations, and then look for the relevant information there to answer the question. That's almost every section. We're finally at the math section. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The math section is hard. To get a perfect score on this section, you're going to need a very strong fundamental knowledge of math concepts and problem solving skills. That is probably beyond the scope of just this video, and I will probably publish a video at a later date that walks through individual math problem types and problem solving tips that I have for each of those different types and categories. Probably the number one tip that I can give you for this section, though, is that even though I say you should focus on math last in the order, what I really mean is that you should finish it last in the order. And that's just because it's going to be the most time consuming to prepare for. While you're studying for the rest of the sections, you can quiz math concepts and work on different math problems throughout the course of your study that you're focusing on the other sections. I ended up filming this video throughout the course of an entire day, so it was pretty time consuming, but I hope that gives you a pretty good overview of how you can approach your study to each of these sections to maximize your score on the ACT. And if you want to stay on top of problem solving methods and walkthroughs of different problems throughout your study for the ACT or SAT, you can follow me, subscribe to my channel, and I'll be uploading shorts, different videos, walking through different test sections and problem examples throughout your time studying. And since I'm starting off as an SAT, ACT tutor and content creator after a pretty long career in tech, I'll probably be making software and tools that you can use to enhance your studying for these standardized tests so you can get the best score possible. So stay tuned for those too, and I hope to see you in another video.